There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, wearing the plain clothes of a Tuesday evening or the simple quiet of a shared room. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through a door you left unlocked, a silence you forgot to fill, and they rearrange the furniture of your entire world while you are not looking. For me, that moment wore the face of my friend, Julian, asleep on my couch. It wasn't the first time, not by a long shot, but on this particular night, the ordinary became seismic. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, charged with the weight of everything I had never said, everything I had meticulously packed away in the locked attics of my heart. He was a man made of sunlight and easy laughter, and I was a creature of shadows and careful observation. And there, in the dim glow of my living room, the space between us felt both impossibly vast and terrifyingly small. This was the precipice. I knew it in the same way an animal knows when the storm is coming. A change in the pressure of the air, a primal hum in the bones. I could either step back into the familiar safety of our friendship, or I could wait and see if the storm would break over us. To understand the weight of him sleeping on my couch, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship, the foundation upon which this precarious moment was built. I met Julian not through a shared class or a mutual friend, but through a transaction. He was the guy who delivered my groceries. In a city that thrived on anonymity and convenience, he was a recurring blip of humanity in my otherwise solitary routine. I'm a photographer, which is a profession that is, by its nature, one of observation. I spend my days looking for the perfect angle, the right light, the unguarded moment that tells a story. My apartment, which doubled as my studio, was my sanctuary and my fortress, a place where I could control the light and curate the silence. The weekly grocery delivery was a necessary intrusion, one I had streamlined to be as impersonal as possible. A few taps on an app, a notification, a brief, masked exchange at the door. It was functional. It was safe. Then came Julian. The first time he arrived, it was different. Most delivery people had a harried, almost frantic energy, a desire to complete the task and move on. Julian moved with an unhurried grace, an athlete's economy of motion that spoke of a body comfortable in its own skin. He was tall, with broad shoulders that the company's polo shirt did little to conceal, and a cascade of dark, unruly curls that fell across his forehead. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were a warm, clear hazel, and they held a genuine, disarming curiosity. He smiled when I opened the door, a real smile that reached his eyes, and said my name not like a data point on a list, but like a greeting. "Leo," he'd asked, and the single word was infused with a warmth that felt entirely out of place in the sterile context of a grocery delivery. "That's me," I had replied, my own voice sounding thin and reedy by comparison. He'd handed over the bags with a casual strength, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, a meaningless accident of proximity, but it sent a jolt through me, a sudden, unwelcome awareness. It was like accidentally touching a live wire you had assumed was dormant. For the rest of the day, I found my thoughts drifting back to that brief contact, to the startling warmth of his eyes. I told myself it was just the isolation of my work, that any small human interaction felt magnified. I was a professional observer, after all. It was my job to notice details. But this felt different. This felt like a detail that was beginning to notice me back. Over the next few weeks, our doorstep interactions began to lengthen. It started with small talk about the weather, the kind of meaningless filler that pads the edges of urban life. But with Julian, it never felt like filler. He'd comment on the photograph I had hanging in my entryway, a stark black and white shot of the city skyline in a storm. He didn't just say it was nice, he asked about it. He wanted to know where I took it, what I was trying to capture. He spoke about it with an articulate interest that took me by surprise. He told me he was a software consultant, working remotely, and that the delivery job was something he did on the side to get out of his own apartment, to feel connected to the city in a physical way. He said he missed the structure of his old life, the one where he was part of a team. He had been a collegiate swimmer, he explained, and the transition to a desk job had left him feeling untethered, adrift in a sea of code and deadlines. I found myself looking forward to Thursdays. It was a ridiculous, juvenile feeling, like waiting for your favorite television show to air. I'd make sure the entryway was clean, that the photograph was straight. I was curating the small window he had into my life, wanting him to see something worthwhile. I started ordering things I didn't necessarily need, just to ensure the order was large enough to warrant a longer interaction. An extra bag of apples, a carton of oat milk I'd probably forget in the back of the fridge. Each purchase was a small, silent investment in a few more seconds of his time. Our conversations deepened, moving from photography to music, from books to the quiet absurdities of living in our building. We discovered we lived on the same floor, just at opposite ends of a long, anonymous hallway. The knowledge reconfigured my understanding of the space I inhabited. The hallway was no longer just a corridor. It was a bridge, a silent, carpeted line connecting my world to his. My feelings for him were like a photograph developing in a darkroom. At first, there was nothing, just a blank sheet of paper submerged in chemicals. Then, slowly, imperceptibly, an image began to emerge. A faint outline, a shadow, a suggestion of a form. I watched it happen from a clinical distance, telling myself I was merely observing a chemical reaction. But the lines grew sharper, the details more defined. The easy way he laughed, throwing his head back. The concentration that would furrow his brow when he was talking about a complex coding problem. The kindness in his eyes when he talked about his family. The image was becoming clearer every day, and it was undeniably a portrait of affection, of a deep and terrifying longing. I was falling for the grocery delivery guy, the man at the other end of the hall, and I did what I always did when faced with a feeling that threatened my carefully controlled world. I documented it, and I hid it away. I kept it locked in the darkroom of my own mind, a perfect, painful image that no one else would ever see. Our friendship was a delicate, beautiful thing, a rare bloom in the concrete desert of my life, and I would sooner cut off my own hand than risk crushing it. The shift, when it came, was not a gradual change, but a sudden fracture. It was a Tuesday, a day of the week that held no significance, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize until I saw his name attached. Julian. It was the first time he had ever contacted me outside the context of a delivery. The message was stark, just 3 words. Are you home? My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, most of them catastrophic. I typed back a simple yes, my thumb trembling slightly. A minute later, there was a soft knock on my door. Not the confident rap of a delivery, but something hesitant, almost broken. When I opened it, the man standing there was a ghost of the Julian I knew. The sunlight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. His shoulders, usually so broad and confident, were slumped in defeat. He looked smaller, diminished. Hey, he said, his voice rough. Sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Come in. Are you okay? It was a stupid question. He was obviously not okay. He stepped inside, and the energy he brought with him was not warmth, but a raw, shivering cold. He stood awkwardly in my living room, looking at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was a ship that had been battered by a storm, sails torn, rudder broken, drifting into the nearest port. And my apartment, my quiet sanctuary, had become that port. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Sarah and I broke up, he said, and the words seemed to cost him everything. Sarah. I knew the name. She was the long-term girlfriend, the one from college. I had seen pictures of her on his social media once, during a late-night session of foolish, self-destructive curiosity. She was beautiful, radiant, the kind of person who looked like she belonged next to someone like Julian. I had built an entire narrative around her in my head, a character in the story of his life that had no room for a quiet, observant photographer down the hall. Her existence had always been a necessary boundary, a clear, bright line that kept my own foolish feelings in their place. And now, That line had been erased. I felt a complex, shameful cocktail of emotions. There was a surge of genuine sympathy for his pain, for the raw grief etched on his face. He was my friend, and he was hurting. But beneath that, stirring in the murky depths, was a tiny, monstrous spark of hope. It was ugly and selfish, and I hated myself for it, but it was there. Her absence created a vacuum, a space, and my heart, against all logic and decency, whispered, "What if?" I pushed the thought away, burying it deep. "Julian, I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it. I led him to the couch, the same couch where this whole story began. He sank into it, his body folding in on itself as if the strings holding him together had been cut. I asked if he wanted anything, water, tea, something stronger. He just shook his head, staring at a fixed point on my far wall, his focus a million miles away. I didn't know what to do. I was a photographer of still lives and empty cityscapes. I captured absence and quiet. I didn't know how to handle this raw, overflowing presence of pain. My instinct was to give him space, to retreat to the other side of the room and let him be. But something held me there. The sight of him so broken, so utterly lost in my living room, overrode my own instinct for self-preservation. So I just sat down in the armchair opposite him, and I waited. I let the silence stretch, not trying to fill it with empty platitudes or useless advice. I just sat there and shared the space with his grief. I became what I had always been, an observer. But this time, I wasn't observing from a distance. I was in the room. I was bearing witness. After a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, he finally spoke, his voice a low murmur. "It's just so quiet," he said, not looking at me. "My apartment. It's never been this quiet." I understood that. My entire life was built around quiet, but my quiet was intentional, curated. His was a sudden, violent void, the sound of an absence. It was the silence left behind when a life you had built with someone else is suddenly dismantled. "You can stay here," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had even fully formed the thought. "As long as you need. It's not quiet here." It was a lie. My apartment was the quietest place I knew. But in that moment, with him in it, it felt different. His breathing, his restless shifting, his sorrow, it filled the space, giving the silence a texture, a weight. He finally turned his head and looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. It was gratitude, maybe, but there was something else, too. Something lost and searching. "Thanks, Leo," he whispered. "Thank you." He didn't stay the night, not that first time. But he stayed for hours, until the city outside my window was dark and spangled with distant lights. We didn't talk much more. I put on a movie, some mindless action film that required no emotional investment, and we watched it in near silence. But it was a shared silence now, not the solitary one I was used to. When he finally left, he paused at the door and gave me a brief, clumsy hug. His arms wrapped around me for just a second, a moment of desperate, unpracticed contact. It was the hug of a drowning man grabbing onto a piece of driftwood. I stood frozen in my hallway long after he was gone, the phantom pressure of his arms still around me. The boundary line had not just been erased. It had been redrawn, and now, somehow, it included me. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet knock and a request for sanctuary. And I had opened the door. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. It wasn't planned or discussed. It simply evolved, born out of his need for noise and my inability to turn him away. A few nights after the breakup, he texted again. Movie night. This time, the question was lighter, an attempt at normalcy. But we both knew what it was really about. It was about him not wanting to be in his quiet apartment and me not wanting him to be alone. He came over with takeout, and we settled onto the couch. The first few times, a careful geography was maintained between us. A couch cushion, a respectable foot of air, a clear demarcation of personal space. We were two separate islands in the small sea of my living room. I was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way the light from the screen flickered across his face, of the sound of his breathing. My own body was a tense wire, humming with a constant, low-grade anxiety. I was so focused on acting normal, on maintaining the plausible deniability of our friendship, that I could barely follow the plots of the movies we were supposedly watching. Then, one night, about 2 weeks in, he fell asleep. We were watching some slow, atmospheric documentary I had chosen, a terrible choice for someone seeking distraction, and I noticed his breathing deepening, his head starting to nod. Slowly, incrementally, his head listed to the side until, with a soft finality, it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. I was trapped, pinned by the gentle weight of his exhaustion and my own crippling affection. The scent of his shampoo, something clean and green, like sandalwood and fresh rain, filled my senses. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was an intimacy so profound, so achingly tender, that it felt like a physical blow. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, and I was sure he must be able to feel it, that its wild rhythm would wake him up. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, a statue carved from fear and longing. My own arm was trapped at an awkward angle, pins and needles beginning to crawl up my skin. Part of me, the sensible, self-preservationist part, screamed at me to move, to gently shift him, to wake him up and tell him he should go to his own bed. It was the logical thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But another part of me, a deeper, more honest part, was mesmerized. This was a gift, a fragile, temporary, and utterly terrifying gift. To have him here, trusting me with his unconsciousness, seeking comfort from me without even knowing it. It was everything I had secretly wanted and everything I was terrified of. It blurred the lines so completely that I could no longer see them. Were we friends? Or were we something else, something unnamed and undefined, existing only in this strange, nocturnal space? I didn't move. I let my arm go numb. I let the credits of the documentary roll and the screen go black, plunging the room into a deeper darkness, punctuated only by the orange glow of the streetlights outside. I sat there in the dark and just held him. I listened to the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of my own heart. In that moment, he was not the confident, sunlit man from the other end of the hall. He was just a person, grieving and exhausted, who had found a safe place to rest. And I was the keeper of that place. The responsibility of it, and the sheer, heartbreaking beauty of it, was overwhelming. After an hour, or maybe two, I knew I couldn't let him sleep on the couch all night. My body ached, and the thought of him waking up in the morning, disoriented and embarrassed on my sofa, was unbearable. It would force a conversation we weren't ready to have. With painstaking slowness, I began to move. I shifted my weight, trying to ease his head off my shoulder without waking him. He stirred, murmuring something incoherent, and for a terrifying second, I thought his eyes would open. But he just settled again, his head now lolling against the back of the couch. I managed to extricate myself, my muscles screaming in protest. I stood over him for a moment, watching his face in the dim light. He looked younger, more vulnerable, the lines of stress and grief smoothed away by sleep. My spare room, which was mostly used for storing camera equipment and prints I hadn't gotten around to framing, had a bed. It was a simple metal frame with a firm mattress, piled with boxes. It took me 20 minutes of silent, frantic work to clear it, moving tripods and light stands with the stealth of a cat burglar. I pulled a clean set of sheets from the linen closet, their crisp, clean scent a stark contrast to the complicated air of the living room. Waking him was the hardest part. I knelt by the couch and gently touched his arm. "Julian," I whispered. His name felt heavy and foreign on my tongue. "Julian, you can't sleep here." He blinked his eyes open, and for a moment, he was completely lost. Confusion clouded his features as he tried to place where he was. "Leo," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "You fell asleep," I explained, keeping my voice low and steady. "Come on. You can use the spare room." He didn't argue. He was too tired. He let me help him up, his body pliant and heavy. I guided him down the short hallway to the other room, my hand on his back. The contact was electric, a necessary guide that felt like a transgression. I pulled back the covers, and he practically fell into the bed, not even bothering to take off his jeans or shirt. He was asleep again before I had even finished pulling the duvet up to his shoulders. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him. The door to the spare room had a faulty latch. It never quite clicked shut unless you gave it a firm push. I pulled it too, but didn't push. I left it slightly ajar. It felt symbolic. An opening. A possibility. A profound and terrible mistake. This became the new pattern, the unspoken ritual that defined our evenings. Movie nights were no longer about the movies. They were a prelude to this strange, domestic intimacy. He would come over, we would eat, we would talk, and at some point, his exhaustion would win. Sometimes he would make it to the spare room on his own, mumbling a tired good night, and disappearing down the hall. Other nights, he would fall asleep on the couch again, and I would have to perform the same delicate operation of waking him and guiding him to bed. I never pushed the door shut. I always left it ajar. It was my own private tell, a secret signal to the universe, or maybe just to myself. It was my way of saying, I am here. The way is open. My apartment transformed. It was no longer just my space. A toothbrush appeared in my bathroom, a brand he liked. A sweatshirt of his was permanently draped over the armchair. My quiet, ordered sanctuary had been gently, irrevocably colonized. I found I didn't mind. The silence he had been running from had been a different kind of silence for me. Mine had been one of solitude. His had been one of loneliness. And somewhere in the middle, in the space between my couch and my spare room, our two silences met and created something new. A quiet that was not empty, but full. Full of presence, of shared breath, of unspoken understanding. My own work began to change. I had always been drawn to empty spaces, to the beauty of decay and absence. Now, I found myself drawn to light, to the way it fell across a rumpled bedsheet in the morning, to the ghost of a warmth left on a couch cushion. I started taking photographs inside my own apartment, trying to capture the subtle shifts, the evidence of a life being lived alongside my own. I was documenting the archaeology of our strange, evolving relationship. A coffee mug left on the table. A pair of shoes by the door. Each one was an artifact, a clue. I was still an observer, but the subject was no longer at a distance. It was all around me, breathing the same air. I lived in a state of suspended animation, a constant, humming tension. Every night was a tightrope walk. I would lie in my own bed, in the room next to his, and stare at the ceiling, my senses on high alert. I could hear the faint sound of him turning over, the creak of the mattress. And I would think about the door, that sliver of an opening between us. It was a question hanging in the air. A test. What would happen if he walked through it? What would happen if I did? The thought was both a prayer and a blasphemy. I wanted it so badly that the wanting itself was a physical ache, a hollow space in my chest. But the fear was just as powerful. Our friendship had become the most important structure in my life, a load-bearing wall. What if my wanting was the one thing that could bring it all crashing down? So I did nothing. I waited. I watched. And I left the door ajar. The night it all changed began like any other. It was a rainy Thursday, the city outside slick and gleaming, the sound of water drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm against my window panes. Julian had been quieter than usual all evening. The initial, raw shock of his breakup had subsided, replaced by a deeper, more pervasive melancholy. He spoke about his work, about a frustrating project and a demanding client, but his words felt disconnected, like he was reciting a script. The usual easy spark in his eyes was dimmed, clouded over by a weariness that seemed to run bone deep. We watched an old black and white film, something moody and atmospheric that matched the weather outside. He didn't fall asleep on the couch. Instead, when the movie ended, he stood up, stretched, and gave me a tired smile. "I think I'm going to turn in," he said, his voice low. "Long day." "Okay," I said, my own voice betraying nothing of the familiar pang of disappointment and relief that accompanied the end of our evenings. "Sleep well, Julian." He walked down the hall to the spare room, and I began my own nightly ritual, collecting the glasses, turning off the television, checking the locks on the door. I moved through the familiar motions, my body on autopilot while my mind was a tangled knot of thoughts. I was so used to this routine, so accustomed to the careful balance of our arrangement, that I had started to believe it could go on forever. This state of limbo, of near intimacy, had become its own kind of normal. It was a painful normal, a half-life of affection, but it was also safe. There were no declarations, so there could be no rejections. There were no questions, so there were no wrong answers. I finished tidying up and went to my own room, leaving the hallway light on, as I always did. I changed and slid into bed, picking up a book from my nightstand, but the words blurred on the page. My focus wasn't there. It was in the room next door. It was on the silence, a silence that felt different tonight. It wasn't the peaceful silence of sleep. It was a tense, wakeful silence. I could feel it, a subtle vibration in the air. I put the book down and turned off my lamp, plunging my own room into darkness. I lay there, listening for the sound of his breathing to deepen, for the telltale creak of the bed as he settled into sleep. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard a different sound, a soft footfall on the hardwood of the hall. Then another. My heart stopped. I was completely still, every muscle in my body frozen. The footsteps were slow, hesitant. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, my ears straining in the darkness. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of his breathing on the other side of the door. He was just standing there. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning until it was a fragile, transparent thread that could snap at any moment. The silence was deafening, filled with the thunder of my own pulse in my ears. What was he doing? What did he want? My mind was a white-hot panic. This was it, the moment I had both dreaded and yearned for. The question that had been hanging in the air for months was about to be asked, or the boundary I had so carefully maintained was about to be crossed. Then, I heard the soft click of the doorknob turning. The sound was impossibly loud in the silent apartment. The door opened a few inches, spilling a thin blade of light from the hallway across my floor. And there he was, a silhouette framed in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his hand still on the knob, looking into the darkness of my room. I couldn't see his expression, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. It was the culmination of every shared silence, every accidental touch, every night spent under the same roof. Everything was converging on this single, terrifying, beautiful moment. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The safe thing to do was to pretend I was asleep, to stay silent, to not move, to let him retreat back into the safety of his own room and pretend this never happened. We could go back to the ritual, back to the unspoken rules and the comfortable ambiguity. But as I looked at his shape in my doorway, I knew I couldn't. I was tired of the ambiguity. I was tired of living in the gray spaces. I was tired of being an observer of my own life. I wanted to be in it. Julian, I whispered, and my voice was a fragile, trembling thing in the quiet. He flinched, as if my voice had startled him, but he didn't leave. He took a slow step into the room, letting the door drift shut behind him, plunging us back into near-total darkness. I could just make out his form as he moved towards the bed. He stopped at the edge, a few feet away. I couldn't sleep, he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of all its usual confidence. It was the voice of a man standing on a cliff edge. I keep thinking. About what? I asked, my own voice barely audible. He was silent for a long moment. I could hear him swallow. About everything, he finally said. About how you're always just here. How you just let me be here. You don't ask for anything. You just make space. He took another step closer, his knees bumping against the edge of my mattress. Leo, I don't think I can do this anymore. A cold dread washed over me. He was ending it. He was going to say this was too weird, that he needed to stand on his own 2 feet, that our friendship was becoming something he couldn't handle. He was going to thank me, and he was going to leave, and the quiet in my apartment would return, but this time it would be the unbearable silence of a true and final absence. I braced myself for the impact. This, pretending, he continued, and his voice cracked on the last word. Pretending this is just me crashing here. Pretending I don't notice the way you look at me sometimes. Pretending I don't feel. He trailed off, his breath catching. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his weight creating a dip in the mattress that felt like a shift in the tectonic plates of my world. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so close. Julian, I started, but I didn't know what I was going to say. He turned his head, and in the faint light filtering through the window, I could just make out the glint of his eyes. Would it be okay? He whispered, and the question was so quiet, so vulnerable, it was almost carried away by the sound of the rain. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The rain, the city, my own frantic heart, it all went silent. All that existed was his question, hanging in the space between us. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a confident move. It was a plea. It was a request for permission. He was giving me all the power. He was laying his own confusion and fear and one at my feet and asking me what to do with it. He was trusting me, not just with his grief, but with his heart. And in that moment, all my own fear evaporated, burned away by the brilliant, shocking flare of his vulnerability. All the months of analysis, of overthinking, of hiding, it all seemed so foolish, so unnecessary. The answer was the simplest thing in the world. I didn't say yes. I didn't need to. I just shifted, moving closer to him, and it was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, his movements tentative, questioning, and then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, cinematic kiss. It was something far more profound. It was soft and hesitant and deeply, deeply gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and rain and a desperate, fragile hope. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the simple, grounding touch was everything. It was a confession. It was a discovery. It was the sound of a door, left ajar for months, finally clicking shut. In the darkness of my room, with the rain tapping against the glass, the world I had so carefully kept at arm's length came rushing in, and it felt like coming home. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that, breathing the same air, our worlds having irrevocably collided and reformed into something new. The silence that followed was not empty or tense. It was a peaceful, humming silence, the kind that comes after the storm has passed, leaving the air clean and charged with life. I could feel the tremor in his hand, still holding my face, and I realized he was just as terrified and overwhelmed as I was. We were two people who had been navigating by maps of our own making, lost in our own private wildernesses, who had just stumbled, miraculously, into the same clearing. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't answer. I just brought my own hand up and covered his, holding it against my skin. It was my way of saying, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We stayed like that for a long time, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over us. It was more than a kiss. It was a threshold. We had crossed it together, and there was no going back. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that replaced months of anxious speculation. The photograph in the darkroom was finally fully developed. The image was clear, and it was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. But peace, I would soon learn, is not a destination. It's a temporary harbor. The morning after the kiss was filled with a fragile, shimmering beauty. I woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering into my room and the unfamiliar, solid weight of Julian sleeping beside me. Sometime during the night, we had shifted, and he had wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me close. His breathing was a steady, warm puff against the back of my neck. I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, trying to commit every detail of the moment to memory. The way the light caught the dark strands of his hair, the relaxed set of his features in sleep, the sheer, unbelievable fact of his presence in my bed. It felt like a dream I was terrified of waking from. This was the reality I had only ever allowed myself to imagine in the most secret corners of my mind, and it was so much simpler and more profound than I had ever pictured. It wasn't a grand, dramatic romance. It was just this, the quiet warmth of another person, the feeling of being safe. When he finally stirred, his eyes blinked open slowly, and for a moment, he looked confused, as if trying to remember how he got here. Then his gaze found mine, and a slow, cautious smile spread across his face. It was a new kind of smile, not his usual bright, easy grin. This one was tentative, questioning, but deeply, achingly tender. "Morning," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Morning," I replied, my own voice soft. There was a universe of unspoken things in that simple exchange. We didn't talk about the night before. We didn't try to define what this was. We just let the moment be what it was. We made coffee together in a comfortable, domestic silence, our bodies moving around each other in the small space of my kitchen with an easy, unpracticed grace. It felt natural. It felt right. When he left to go back to his own apartment to shower and change, he kissed me again, a brief, sweet press of his lips that was both a promise and a reassurance. I spent the rest of the day in a state of euphoric disbelief. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. My old apartment, my fortress of solitude, felt different. It felt like a home. I thought, foolishly, that this was it. This was the happy ending. I had forgotten that stories don't just end at the climax. There is always the aftermath. The withdrawal was subtle at first. A text that went unanswered for a few hours longer than usual. A movie night that was canceled at the last minute with a vague excuse about work. I told myself I was being paranoid. He was busy. His life didn't revolve around me. I was so terrified of seeming needy or demanding that I gave him space, an abundance of it. I retreated back into my own shell, waiting for him to make the next move, telling myself that the ball was in his court. But the space I gave him grew wider, stretching from a few feet to a chasm. The easy intimacy of that morning began to feel like a hallucination, a beautiful mirage that had evaporated in the harsh light of day. After 3 days of near-complete silence, a cold, sickening dread began to pool in my stomach. The silence was no longer the comfortable, shared quiet we had built. It was the old silence, the one he had been running from, the one that spoke of absence and loneliness. But now it was for me. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been a confession. It had been a moment of grief-fueled confusion. A mistake. I was the convenient port in a storm, and now that the storm was passing, he was ready to set sail again, leaving me behind on the shore. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest withered and died, leaving behind a bitter ash. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of desperate comfort for genuine affection. The anger came next, a hot, protective wave that surprised me with its intensity. It wasn't just directed at myself for being so stupid. It was directed at him, at his confusion, at his silence. He had come to my door. He had crossed the threshold. He had asked the question. He had initiated the kiss. And now he was retreating, leaving me to deal with the emotional wreckage. It wasn't fair. Our friendship, the thing I had guarded so carefully, was now in ruins. And for what? For a moment of his own emotional chaos? The quiet observer in me was done observing. For the first time, I felt the need to act, to demand, to understand. I waited another day, a torturous 24 hours in which every buzz of my phone sent a jolt of false hope through me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, the same path he had taken so many times to come to my door, and I knocked on his. My heart was pounding, a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I was terrified. Terrified of what he would say, terrified of the confirmation of my worst fears. But the fear of not knowing was even worse. He opened the door, and the change in him was stark. He looked tired, yes, but it was more than that. He looked haunted, and his eyes, those warm hazel eyes, wouldn't meet mine. They darted around, looking at the wall behind me, at the floor, anywhere but at my face. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a guarded, anxious energy. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. Hey, hey. I replied, my own voice tight. I had planned to be calm, to be rational. But seeing him there, so distant and closed off, My carefully constructed composure crumbled. Are you going to let me in? Or are we going to have this conversation in the hallway? Surprise flickered across his face. This was a new Leo, one he hadn't seen before. This was not the quiet, patient observer. He stepped back without a word and let me in. His apartment was the mirror image of mine in layout, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where mine was curated and calm, his was a space of organized chaos. Books piled on surfaces, a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams and code, a single, wilting plant on the windowsill. And it was quiet. So incredibly quiet. I finally understood what he had meant that first night. The silence in his apartment felt heavy, suffocating. I turned to face him. He was still not looking at me, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, his shoulders hunched. "What's going on, Julian?" I asked, and the question came out sharper than I intended. "Nothing," he mumbled, shrugging. "Just been busy with work." "Don't," I said, my voice low and firm. "Don't do that. Don't lie to me. Not after. Not after everything." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery that was so profound it stole my breath. It wasn't the look of someone who didn't care. It was the look of someone who cared too much and was terrified by it. "I can't do this, Leo," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Can't do what?" I pressed, my own hurt making me cruel. "Can't pretend to be my friend anymore? Can't handle the awkwardness now that you've gotten what you needed? Was I just a convenient place to land while you were falling apart?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, and a look of deep, genuine pain crossed his face. "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "God, no. It's not that. It's not you. It's me. I'm the one who's messed up." He sank down onto his own sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with a silent sob. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come, replaced by a familiar, aching sympathy. I walked over and sat down next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. I didn't touch him. "Then talk to me," I said, my voice gentle again. "Please. The silence is killing me. I just need to understand." He took a long, shuddering breath and slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed. "When Sarah and I were together," he began, his voice rough, "it was easy. It was the path of least resistance. We met in college. We were on the same track. Everyone expected it. It was comfortable. But it was never honest. Not really. I was playing a part. The person I was supposed to be. And I was good at it. For a long time, I even convinced myself." He looked at me, his gaze direct and unflinching now. "And then I met you. And it was just different. It was quiet. It was real. Being your friend was the first thing in a long time that felt completely, 100% honest. There was no performance. I could just be. And I didn't want to mess that up. I valued it too much." "So what changed?" I asked softly. "Everything," he said with a humorless laugh. "When things with Sarah ended, I was a wreck. But it wasn't just because I missed her. I was grieving the life I thought I was supposed to have. The future that was all mapped out. I was completely lost. And I ran to you. Because you were the only place that felt safe. The only person who didn't expect me to be anything other than what I was in that moment." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And then, in the middle of all that, I started to feel something else. Something for you. And it terrified me, Leo. Because it felt just as real and honest as our friendship. But it was bigger, and it was scarier. And I didn't trust it. I thought maybe it was just a rebound. Just me latching onto the first kind person who showed me a safe harbor. I thought it was just my grief talking. And that night, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing I've done in years. And that's what scared me." "Why?" I whispered. "Why would that scare you?" "Because," he said, his voice dropping so low I could barely hear him. "What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just as broken as I feel, and I'm dragging you into my mess? What if I hurt you? Hurting you would be. I couldn't live with that. Our friendship was this perfect, clean thing. And I felt like I had just thrown a rock through a beautiful stained glass window. I panicked. I thought if I pulled back, if I gave it space, maybe I could fix it. Maybe we could go back." "We can't go back, Julian," I said, and the words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. That door is closed. I know, he said, his voice filled with regret. I know. I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared of breaking the best thing in my life that I ended up breaking it anyway. I finally closed the distance between us, laying my hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath my touch. You didn't break it, I said, my voice steady. You just complicated it. You're right to be scared. I'm scared too. I've been in love with you for months, and I've been terrified of it every single day. I was terrified of being the one to throw the rock. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a shocked, dawning realization. What? I've been falling for you since you asked me about that photograph in my entryway. I admitted, and the confession felt like a great, unburdening exhale. Every movie night, every time you fell asleep on my couch, I was walking a tightrope. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't, because our friendship was too important. A slow, wondrous light began to dawn in his eyes, chasing away the shadows. It was the sunlight I had missed so desperately. You too, he breathed, a look of utter disbelief on his face. Me too, I confirmed with a small, watery smile. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the war in his eyes, the fear battling with a nascent, burgeoning hope. And then, slowly, hope began to win. He let out a long, shuddering breath that was half sob, half laugh. He reached out and cupped my face in his hands, just as he had done in the darkness of my bedroom. His touch was still tentative, but this time it was not a question. It was a statement. So we're both idiots, he said, a real smile finally reaching his eyes. Complete and utter idiots, I agreed, my own smile breaking through. And we're both scared, he continued. Terrified, I said. Good, he said, his thumb stroking my cheeks. Then we can be scared together. And then he kissed me again. And this time, there was no hesitation. There was no confusion. There was just a profound, overwhelming, and deeply comforting sense of recognition. It was the feeling of two lost ships, having weathered their respective storms, finally finding the same safe harbor and dropping anchor for good. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a real one. And it was built not on a flawless foundation, but on the messy, beautiful, honest truth of our shared fear and our shared hope. The days and weeks that followed that conversation were a process of careful, intentional reconstruction. We didn't fall into an easy, immediate rhythm. Instead, we built one, brick by brick, with honesty and patience. The ambiguity that had plagued us was gone, replaced by a quiet, spoken certainty. We talked. We talked for hours, late into the night, unraveling all the tangled threads of unspoken feelings, misunderstandings, and fears. He told me more about the slow erosion of his relationship with Sarah, the pressure he'd felt to conform to a life that wasn't his. I told him about my solitude, about the walls I had built around myself, and how his friendship had been the first thing to make me want to find the door. It was like we were both learning a new language, a language of vulnerability, and we were clumsy at it, but we were patient with each other's mistakes. The rituals changed. Movie night was no longer a pretext. It was just a movie night. But now, there was no carefully maintained geography on the couch. He would wrap an arm around me, and I would lean my head on his shoulder, and there was no tension, no analysis, just a simple, grounding comfort. He still stayed over most nights, but he no longer used the spare room. The spare room door was now firmly, definitively closed. He slept in my bed, beside me, his presence a constant, reassuring warmth in the dark. The first few nights, we were almost shy with each other, two strangers learning the topography of a new land. But soon, the shyness gave way to a deep, restful ease. Waking up next to him became my new normal, a quiet miracle I greeted with a silent, grateful heart every morning. His things began to migrate from his apartment to mine, not by accident this time, but by design. A box of books, his favorite coffee mug. More of his clothes appeared in my closet, hanging next to mine. My apartment, once a minimalist fortress of one, began to take on the comfortable, lived-in clutter of two. We were building a life in the space between his organized chaos and my curated calm. We found a rhythm that was uniquely ours. I would wake early, a habit from years of chasing the morning light, and make coffee while he was still asleep. He would emerge from the bedroom, hair a mess, and wrap his arms around me from behind as I stood at the counter, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. They were small moments, mundane and ordinary, but they were the bedrock of our new reality. They were the 1,000 tiny, daily affirmations that this was real. One Saturday afternoon, we tackled his apartment. He said he couldn't stand the silence there anymore, that it was haunted by a life that was no longer his. So we packed it up. We sorted through his things, deciding what to keep, what to store, what to give away. It was an emotional, cathartic process. He would hold up an object, a framed photo, a souvenir from a trip, and tell me its story. It felt like he was entrusting me with his past, letting me see all the pieces of himself, the ones he was proud of and the ones he was ready to let go. As I helped him wrap his life in boxes, I realized I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant. My hands were helping to dismantle his old life to make room for our new one. We didn't move all his things into my apartment. It was too small, too much my own space. Instead, we found a new place together, a place that belonged to neither of us and therefore could belong to both of us. It had big windows that let in the afternoon light, which made me happy, and it was close to a park with running trails, which made him happy. The day we signed the lease, he held my hand the entire time, his grip firm and steady. It was a public declaration, a simple gesture that said, "We are a we." That night, we celebrated not with a fancy dinner, but by ordering takeout and eating it on the floor of our new, empty living room, our voices echoing in the vacant space. We talked about where the couch would go, what color we should paint the walls, what kind of photographs I would hang. We were designing a future together. The fear never vanished completely. Sometimes I would watch him sleeping, and a faint echo of the old anxiety would stir in me. The fear of it all being a dream. The fear that I was not enough to hold on to someone so full of light. And sometimes I would see a shadow cross his face, a flicker of the old uncertainty, and I knew he was wrestling with his own ghosts. But the difference was, now we could talk about it. He would sense my anxiety and pull me closer, whispering, "I'm not going anywhere," and I would see his fear and take his hand, reminding him, "We're in this together." We learned to be harbors for each other, offering shelter when the old storms threatened to roll in. We learned that love wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to walk through it, hand in hand. One evening, months later, we were curled up on the couch in our new living room. A gentle snow was falling outside, blanketing the city in a soft, muffling quiet. It was a different kind of quiet from the ones we had known before. It was peaceful. It was shared. Julian was asleep, his head resting in my lap, his breathing deep and even. I ran my fingers through his dark curls, the motion familiar and comforting. I looked at his face, so peaceful in sleep, and I thought back to that first night he had fallen asleep on my old couch, how my body had been a rigid knot of terror and longing. I thought about the door left ajar, the hallway that was a bridge, the silence that was a scream. All those architectural metaphors for a heart that was too afraid to ask for what it wanted. Now, all the doors were open, and all the hallways had led here. To this room, to this couch, to this quiet, simple moment. The journey had been fraught with fear and uncertainty, a slow, painful development process. But the image that had emerged was clearer and more beautiful than I had ever dared to hope. It was a portrait of us. It was a picture of home. He was no longer just the guy who delivered my groceries, a recurring blip of humanity in my solitary life. He was the man who had knocked on my door in a storm and shown me that the safest harbor is not a place of solitude, but a place you build with someone else. He had delivered my heart back to me, not by filling its emptiness, but by showing me I had the courage to share it. And as the snow fell outside, we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.